And without further ado, I wanted to welcome Chris. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. And yes, like Sue said, this is geared more towards Falmouth. So it'll be a lot of the places that are in my restaurants book are here. But in order to make this worth your while for actually being part of this Zoom presentation, I added some places that are not in the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my presentation up so that you can see it, because it's more exciting to see the actual presentation. And so I wrote this book, Historic Restaurants of Cape Cod. This was in 2017. And for those who don't know me, I'm a 12th generation Cape Codder, and I've written a total of 6 books. My most recent one is in the bottom right corner. That's Iconic Hotels and Motels of Cape Cod. That one, along with Cape Cod Nights, will be featured next week. And that one will also be a presentation that is Falmouth centric. So it'll be a lot of fun. This one was a lot of fun to put together too, because I had to do more research and find places that you will hopefully remember. And if you don't, then I can bring them back to life for you. So in June of 2015, that's when I started chronicling the legendary Cape Cod restaurants. It was part of Arcadia Publishing's History Press label. And the end result was Historic Restaurants of Cape Cod. So the book itself is 39 restaurants. All of them are since closed. But there's a 40th chapter that includes recipes from many of the restaurants that are in the book. And I was lucky because I've done a lot of work for Cape Cod Life magazine. And way back when they first started in the late 70s, early 80s, they would have recipes from restaurants in their magazine. And they basically told me in exchange for mentioning that they're from the Cape Cod Life magazine, I could use any recipes I wanted. So it ended up being a great sort of win-win. So that's the last chapter of the book. The rest, so I covered the entirety of Cape Cod in the book. I didn't want to show favoritism. I grew up in Yarmouth, live in Yarmouth, so naturally I could close my eyes and think of 24 restaurants from near where I live from my lifetime. But what I did was hundreds and hundreds of hours of research to make sure that the entirety of the Cape was represented. The basis of this book was a 2005 Ohio State University study that explained that 60% of restaurants don't survive their first season and 80% go under within 5 years. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen restaurants. I mean, COVID kind of accelerated some, but before that you would see restaurants come in, have a big grand opening, and fade away within a year or two. What I focused on was those restaurants that had come and gone, but they had a huge impact. They came and made a big impact. And so this book is filled with a lot of those. And for those of you that, beyond Falmouth, I mean, you probably have heard of Thompson's Clam Bar, Mildred's Chowder House, places like that. That's some examples of ones that are outside of Falmouth. But without further ado, let's take a stroll down memory lane, places that you will know and love and remember. So this one I put first because it's very unique. It was on the top of my list as far as Falmouth centric restaurants. Now, granted, it's in Woods Hole, but it's so close. So the Dome restaurant, the reason why I put this front and center first as far as places to talk about is because it's being worked on currently. So the plan is for the actual dome itself to be restored and possible senior housing to be built around it in the site of the former Nautilus Motor Inn. In 2016, the area was purchased for $2.9 million by a group called Woods Hole Partners, and that's who's working on it right now. So the Dome restaurant, for those not familiar with it, it's down right near the Steamship Authority. So I've told people, if you're driving down, going towards the Steamship Authority, once you can see the water, you're basically passing by the Dome. It is an authentic geodesic dome, much like Epcot Center in Disney. And there's a reason why, because they were built by the same person, a man named R. Buckminster Fuller. And he built this 54-foot diameter geodesic dome. And the restaurant itself opened in 1954, and it was 170 seats. The dome was the dining room. The kitchen and the rest of the facilities were attached to it. And obviously, it's a very unique restaurant. You can see in that image on the right, it's a postcard from the Falmouth Historical Society, that eating in a geodesic dome is quite unique. And so people would flock to it. But the problem was, the geodesic dome in the summer especially conducts itself like a greenhouse, which made it very hot. And if you're talking the 50s and 60s, air conditioning wasn't as prevalent. I mean, it was, but what they had to do, and you can see in that picture on the right, on the left-hand side of the postcard, there's that white thing hanging down. It's a tarp. The tarp was put over much of the dome to shield it from the sun and keep it from getting too hot. And so unfortunately, it got to be, you wanted to eat at the dome for the view, and then most of the view was obstructed by a tarp because it was too hot. The dome closed in 2002 officially. It has been sitting there basically decaying for the last nearly 20 years. There's been plans to, at the very least, preserve it for history, but now the idea is to refurbish the dome and create the senior housing near it. So luckily, this spot will seemingly be around for a long time. However, the dome is far from the only spot in Falmouth that gained iconic status. So, do you remember Elsie's, also known as Elsie's Lunch? So this spot was located on Palmer Avenue, and this is also a postcard from the Falmouth Historic Society. This restaurant was owned by a couple, Elsie and Henry Bowman, and they're very unique because they fled Germany ahead of World War II in the late 1930s, and they actually settled up in Boston. And in 1955, Elsie and Henry opened a sandwich shop in Harvard Square that was also called Elsie's, and it was very popular. They had sandwiches like Fresser's Dream, which was essentially, you would consider it a New York deli sandwich or a Dagwood, depending on what you know it as, with ham, turkey, and corned beef. They also had the Elsie's roast beef special, which was roast beef and onions, German mustard, Russian dressing, and relish. And Elsie worked hard. She worked hard at her restaurant in Harvard Square. And what ended up happening was in 1965, she had a heart attack. So basically, they told her, you need to retire. And what Elsie did was she retired to Cape Cod, moved to Falmouth, and stayed retired for about a year before she opened the second Elsie's, which was on Palmer Avenue in 1966. It stayed open through 1986. It was very popular all the way through before she eventually really retired in 1986. And now the spot is a place called Crab Apples, which is still there. That was Elsie's way back in the day. Some of these legendary establishments are still standing and still open today. And that's a neat thing about doing this being Falmouth centric, was the original Historic Restaurants book every place in there was closed. And my publisher, they dealt with that one all right. They made it a point that for the Cape Cod Nights book, the nightlife, I needed to have at least a few places that were still open in there. And the iconic hotels and motels, they needed at least half of them to still be open. So luckily, a place like the Silver Lounge restaurant, which is still open, that's neat because you can see the presentation and then go out to Route 28A and check them out. They've been open since 1938. They've got a unique nautical theme inside where there's driftwood adorning some of the walls in there from local beaches. They're known for seafood, steaks, sandwiches, typical American fare. The property was once owned by a man named Manuel White, and it was bought by William Early, and he's the one that opened it on May 28th, 1938. And Early, he was a cross promotion. He came from a spot called the Coonamessett Inn. And they're still going strong. There's Uncle Bill's Country Store, which is a gift shop right next to it. So that's another spot. Route 28A, that's kind of the nice back roads, but not back roads, where Route 28, I know out there, is more of a highway. But some of these places are a part of recent Cape Cod history. And that talks to, on the left, the Nimrod. That just recently was torn down. It was on Dillingham Avenue. And it's mostly known for being hit by a cannonball during the War of 1812. The restaurant itself was named for the British ship, the HMS Nimrod. So this wasn't the original location of the Nimrod, Dillingham Avenue. It was actually located at a different spot in town, and it was known as the Boxwood Club. But then in the 1950s, it was moved to its spot at Dillingham Avenue, where it flourished from there. The problem was that as it turned to the 21st century, the building was falling out of code to the point where I guess if the owners had taken steps earlier, it probably could have been saved. But it turned out that when they went to the health department and such to see how much it would cost to bring the building up to code, it was $2 million. And this is more than 10 years ago. So they ended up closing the restaurant officially in 2012, and the building decayed. People came in looking to buy, but what ended up happening was they bought it more for the property and less for the restaurant itself. Now it's an empty lot, unfortunately. They tried to save it to make it, a part of the Register of Historic Places, but it did not happen. The Leaside Bar and Grill, that, much like the Dome, it's within eyesight of the Steamship Authority. That was Luscombe Avenue, right there near Water Street in Woods Hole. They were open for more than 60 years as kind of a restaurant bar. And it's known for its odd shape because it's where two roads meet. So it's got almost a triangular shape to it. The building itself is still there. In 2013, the Leaside closed, and it was quickly purchased and reopened as Quick's Hole Tavern. So that is still there. It's interesting to see these places and know that you can go back and you can see a place like the Leaside, even though it's a different name now. Other spots that were in the book and that I researched for this presentation are part of a bygone generation. The Bellows is an interesting one. It was on Falmouth Heights Road. And from 1933 to 48, it was a restaurant. It was started as more of a tea room, which it's kind of lighter fare, lunch, and obviously tea. But it was opened by a woman named Tekla Headland, and she was from Long Island. And it was a tea room with lobster, and more. So it started as a tea room, but she had a connection that could get her fresh lobster. So she decided she'd be crazy not to do that. So it became more of a breakfast and lunch place, and it was very successful. The problem was that Tekla Headland, even though she had her family helping her out, it's a lot of work to run a successful restaurant, even one that's only open during the summer. She would be down on the Cape for the summer, spring, summer, and go back to Long Island in the off season. In 1946, she had a massive stroke and died shortly thereafter. What ended up happening was the family sold the Bellows itself, the restaurant, and a man came in and bought it, ran it for 2 more years as the Bellows. But when you buy an existing restaurant and it's yours, you say you're going to run it as the previous owners did, but then you get your own ideas of what you want to do with that property since you own it. So what they did was change the name to the Red Horse Grill. That only lasted for about 2 years before it became known as the Red Horse Inn. And the Red Horse Inn is still standing. So unfortunately, I couldn't get a better photo with the postcard on the right, but it's the same building. And if you come for next week's presentation, the Red Horse Inn is front and center. So you may hear a little bit of this similarity. But the Bellows was one of those hidden gems that when doing my research for the restaurants book, it was something I had never heard of. And it was a neat, unique story of a tea room that became a successful breakfast lunch place with lobster. And Tekla Headland, she was a unique person to run this spot. So also following along those lines of the Bellows was the Hangar Tea Room. And the reason why I put this, I could not find a photo of the Hangar Tea Room. So the Megansett Tea Room in North Falmouth, it's the same kind of idea where, like I mentioned, a tea room is lighter fare, sandwiches, drinks. The Hangar Tea Room is an interesting one, and I wrote a longer story about it I have a blog called the In My Footsteps podcast blog now, and I do a lot of Cape Cod history over there. I used to write a lot for capecod.com. I did Cape Cod history articles. I left there about 2 years ago because I wanted to basically write about things I found interesting and not have to run it by an editor. So that's what I ended up doing. And the Hangar Tea Room is a pretty good story that's on that blog. So it started off in 1923 as a tea room called the Gray Gull. And then a woman named Mary Fellows, she bought it and ran it throughout much of the 1920s. And it had music and dancing. This is during Prohibition. So when you're running a place that has entertainment during Prohibition, you've got to make it good because there's no alcohol to kind of keep people around. In 1930, it became known as the Hangar Tea Room. And this is where the story gets interesting. There was a man named William Wagner who bought it and ran it. The problem was that there was a lot of complaints about noise, cars parked all over the place, and also people drunk stumbling out into the street. So during Prohibition, when all these things are happening, that kind of gets the antenna going of the local police. And what ended up happening was on November 3rd, 1933, the police raided the Hangar Tea Room and they found alcohol, they found gambling equipment in there, and they essentially shut them down briefly. What happened was William Wagner, not too long after, Prohibition was overturned not too long after they were raided, so it was right on the cusp. So after Prohibition was overturned, William Wagner tried to go and get an actual liquor license for the Hangar Tea Room, and he was turned down. Even though it was so close to the end of Prohibition, the town didn't forget that he had his speakeasy there. So he even had his wife, Dorothy, running it, trying to get her, like, all right, we're not associated with William Wagner anymore, but still his wife. Eventually, they gave them a liquor license, but it was too late. They closed down before the end of the 1930s. And William Wagner, he did not like having his liquor license application turned down. So he decided to run for selectman in the town. And unfortunately for him, he ran for selectman 11 times and he lost 11 times. So he did not have much luck once he was raided by the police in 1933. It kind of went downhill from there. Some of these spots were a short drive away, and Quintals was just over the Bourne Bridge. Today, it's a Dunkin' Donuts and a Speedway, I believe, right where the Bourne Rotary is that leads you into Wareham or up onto Route 25. Quintals was open from the mid 60s through 2005. And I'm actually working on an in-depth article about the history of the Quintals and the family, Robert and Gloria, who started it, because I didn't realize how far their reach went. I thought of Quintals as Bourne / Buzzards Bay and this one restaurant, but it turns out they had 4 restaurants at once. So they had this one here. They opened one in Hyannis at the Airport Rotary in the early 80s. So it was Red Coach Grill. Later, it was Chili's. And in between, it was Quintal's Red Cabin. And it was brief. They only had it there for maybe 3 years. And it's interesting because they expanded, and all of the expansions didn't last that long. Because in Yarmouth, they had Quintal's Seafood was the name of it. I believe they opened in 1979. And by 1983, they were closed and replaced by Oliver's, which is still there. The other one was actually on the Cranberry Highway in Wareham, and it was called the Crack o' Dawn. They actually weren't too long ago that they closed down, within the last 7-8 years, and they were more of a breakfast place, Crack o' Dawn, with a little rooster on the sign. Interesting thing about Quintals was they, in 2005, after the parents, Robert had passed away and Gloria she was older, she was retired. They were selling it and they planned on closing it at the end of the 2005 season. But a fire broke out in June of 2005, and they took it as a sign, basically, that they didn't have the money or the time to repair the restaurant to reopen for a few more months. So they just closed it down. And it was interesting. They sold it to Christy Myhouse, who he put his Christie's in there, but then he went out of business. And on the right, the Flume was located in Mashpee. It's now the Knockabout Brewery, but it was owned for 32 years by High Chief Earl Mills. He was known as Flying Eagle of the Wampanoag tribe. And what he did was he had his own recipes that he grew up with from his family, his parents, and he put that into everything, all of his meals at the Flume. It was interesting. I interviewed Earl Mills for the restaurant's book. And it's just a funny story because I had him come and speak at the book launch event for it. And he was telling a lot of the same stories that he told me on the phone. The only problem was, on the phone, his stories were very R-rated with a lot of swears. And as he's telling these stories about working in a kitchen and being a chef, I just was cringing, like, oh God, please don't swear so much, because I was trying to keep it where people were recording it. But he didn't. He was good about that. Another interesting thing, so there's a recipe in the book from the Flume. It's his Indian pudding. And I spoke to him. I said, "Oh yeah, I put a recipe of yours in the book from Cape Cod Life magazine." And he quickly cut me off and he said, "Oh yeah, that's not the right recipe." And I was like, "Wait, what do you mean?" And he was writing a cookbook of his own at the time. And what he told me was, "Why the hell would I give them the recipe for free when I could put it in my book and make money off of it?" And Earl Mills, he's a hoot. He was worth the time to interview. And there were icons of the Falmouth restaurant scene like Danny Kaye's, which is on Route 28. It was opened from 1959 to 1977. Classic Italian restaurant owned by the Bartolome family. The grandson of the owners, Jay Bartolome, he owns a spot called the Villaggio in Catuit. So if you went to Danny Kaye's and you enjoyed their food, you can go and kind of get a taste of it at the Villaggio. I find it interesting that Danny Kaye's was an icon of Falmouth restaurants, and yet the spot that replaced it, the Golden Sales Chinese restaurant, has been around for more than twice as long as Danny Kaye's was there. And I don't know, I've never eaten at the Golden Sales. I don't know how it is, but they've been there for more than 40 years. And there were also legends nearby. The Tin Man Diner, so it ended up being a part of Falmouth restaurants, but it got its start far away from there. So the diner car itself, so on the right, the original was called a Sterling Streamliner diner car. The original was known as the Jimmy Evans Flyer, and it was located in New Bedford and opened in 1940. Jimmy Evans was a vaudeville entertainer, and he didn't run it himself. He had his wife run it, but he put his name on it, figuring that Jimmy Evans, people would know him and come to eat there thinking, he's got his name on it. It must be good. In 1960, the Jimmy Evans Flyer was purchased, and it was
No, that's it. He just referenced. Oops. He just referenced building quality joint tissue takes about 8 to 10 months. And I didn't exactly know what that meant.
Not sure I follow that. So the Tin Man Diner was moved to the Otis Rotary, where it stayed open as the Otis Rotary Diner in the 1970s. Then later on, it was known as Mary Muffins. But then it was leased to a woman named Barbara Lynn. She's on the left-hand side of the left photo with her daughter. And it was renamed My Tin Man Diner. It had a lot of military memorabilia and Wizard of Oz memorabilia located in there. Unfortunately, in 2000, it was subject to arson. The jealous boyfriend of a waitress there burned the building down. And it was sad because a lot of the regular customers would come to the charred remains in the parking lot and sit there and have coffee where the building used to be. Luckily, there was a happy ending because in 2008, it was resurrected in Falmouth, and that's the one that's on the left. It lasted for another 3 years on County Road in North Falmouth before eventually closing in 2011. But that was one. Interviewing Barbara Lind, it spoke to the overall impact that these restaurants had. Barbara Lind sent me these photos of the Tin Man Diner, and she was so overwhelmed with happiness and almost like a validation that I had included her building, her restaurant in my book. And that's the way I found it with this book, that I didn't put any spot in there that I didn't think belonged as a historic iconic Cape Cod location. And that's what I found. That's why when doing the research for the Falmouth area, I wanted to make sure it was places that stuck out, that deserved to be mentioned and remembered. And no matter what, though, these spots in there, they deserve to be remembered and celebrated for the good, more than the good food, but the good memories that they give to people. And that's kind of where I fall on this, that it's bringing back the memories and how you felt being there just as much as it is about the restaurants themselves. And I finished it with a couple of different shots of Main Street, Falmouth. One looks like it's from the early 40s and the other is from the probably early 60s. But that's where we wrap things up with my presentation on historic restaurants of the Falmouth area. And if there are any questions, I will do my best to answer them. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So if Sue, I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
open it up.
Oh, okay. Yeah. We had one in the chat and someone asked, what about Lawrence's? Do you know anything about that one?
That is one that I've heard of. I think Lawrence's Sandwich Shop is that, because that's been on a, I don't know much about it myself, but it was on my list for the original book. The idea is some places had, as I say, more meat on the bone. Thankfully, in the years since I did this book, there's been more in the way of research opportunities, online newspaper archives that have allowed me to expand. That's why a place like Quintal's or a place like the Hangar Tea Room that I wasn't able to get in the original book, I can now research because of these expanded. I mean, Falmouth Library, they've got the newspaper archives. They go up to 1962, I believe. So those are fun to check out.
Yeah, we actually have we have microfilm too. Oh, hold on one second. Yeah, we have microfilm of those. If you could turn your camera on if you have a question and just raise your hand and then we'll know who's talking. Does anyone? Okay. Yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to ask a question or mention anything about any of these restaurants, just turn your camera on if you can, or if you don't have a camera, you can unmute yourself too.
Well, I see in the chat about the casino. The casino,
Oh, yeah.
next week, that's from my Cape Cod Nights book. There were some places that doubled as restaurants and nightclubs. There were some that doubled as restaurants and hotels. So I had to pick and choose what went where. Now, that's not to say that I didn't have places that were in multiple books. A place like the Columns that used to exist in West Dennis was in the restaurants book and in the nightlife book because it doubled as a jazz club. So the casino you will see.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about your research for these books too? Like how do you approach these books when you write them?
So first thing with this restaurants book, basically the publisher came to me and said, you can have anywhere from 5 to 40 restaurants. And that was basically the only restriction I had. So what I did was I asked family, parents, grandparents, friends about Cape Cod. What places do you remember going that you liked? And I jotted all of them down. I think I ended up with almost 100.
Wow.
And then what I did was pick the ones that I knew were the big time ones. Thompson's Clam Bar, Mildred's Chowder House, and the like. And then ones that I wasn't as familiar with, like when I saw the Dome, I said, oh my God, this place is awesome because you can still go see it. I mean, it's kind of decayed, but hopefully they're fixing it. But you start to pick your definite ones that go in there. And I had a plan to do 40 restaurants. It was a nice round number with 40,000 words was kind of the word count, but it ended up not happening. So that's where the recipes came from.
Oh, yeah, that's, yeah.
Smith's Old Surrey Rum is next week too. You're picking ones that, see, they fell kind of in between, where, believe me, I've got photos of both. Smith's Old Surrey Rum is going to be in the Cape Cod Nights next week. And the Casino, Brothers 4. It's interesting, when I did my research for the Cape Cod Nights book, I didn't realize that Terrace Gables, which is, it's next week as well, a huge luxury hotel right on Falmouth Heights, right on the Falmouth Road Race running route. I didn't realize that that became Brothers 4, that it was basically, they just put a nightclub / entertainment complex into this hotel.
Mhm.
And that the same with the Casino, that they were like neighbors. And it's so interesting that it got repurposed as that. But oh, believe me, that's coming too.
Cool. Yeah, that'll be a great presentation, especially, yeah, it'll cover a lot because it's a hotel, it's 2 different books, hotels and nightclubs, so.
Yes.
Sure.
And I've got a whole brand new presentation for that as well.
Oh, that's great. No, we appreciate that because even your books to begin with, cover a lot. So the fact that you went and found even more on Falmouth, that's great.
And I took it as kind of a challenge to make it where it was worth it for the people that came to check it out, to make it where it wasn't just 3 or 4 places from the book, that it fleshed out to a full presentation. And Falmouth was easier than if you told me to do it for like Wellfleet. Wellfleet would be a lot harder. Truro, I don't think they were even represented in the restaurants book, and I tried. But Truro, it was needle in a haystack.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of restaurants there, that's for sure.
Well, I don't think I could name you one currently, let alone back 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, maybe one. Okay, does anyone have any questions or does anyone have any comments in any of these restaurants if they had been there?
Yes, did I do justice to, because so the places, I could tell you the ones that I pulled from the book that I have, you can tell the ones I have more knowledge of: the Dome, Elsie's, the Bellows, the Flume, Tin Man Diner. But places like the Lee Side and the Nimrod, those I weren't as familiar with. So I tried to do my best to get information that I could share so that it wasn't just a photo and me skipping by.
Yeah, I'm not from Falmouth myself, so I don't know any of these, but I'm sure some of these folks probably do. And someone typed that they had some good memories.
I wonder if anyone knew about the Hangar Tea Room and the Speakeasy, because that was fascinating. I did an article about it that goes way more in depth, but I've started to become a big fan of finding speakeasies and writing about them. There was one, I'm from Yarmouth, and there's a famous one called the Casa Madrid that's down near the beaches. And it basically, in 1933, it opened as dinner and dancing. And within 6 weeks, they had been raided and shut down because they were a speakeasy and they didn't hide it very well. There were Boston-based politicians that were supposedly, legend has it, there when it got raided, and they jumped out the back window to escape.
Wow. Yeah, that would be interesting. Well, maybe someone will come to us with some of these stories at some point and we can relay them.
Yeah, definitely. If anyone has any places they want me to research and then do a future article on, I also do podcasts and I share a lot of Cape Cod history there. The podcast is more New England centric, but I did a standalone about the Cape Cod Coliseum and things like that.
Yeah, and I think on your website is probably your email, I assume, that people can contact you if they have questions.
Yes.
Or, I mean, I have it too, but I think you have it posted on your website too.
And the website is good. So it has my first 5 books. My 6th one hasn't been uploaded yet, but obviously you can get it pretty much anywhere. And it's got a link to my podcast and a link to, I was on Chronicle 2 years ago this week, so I have that embedded there so you can see it.
Oh, wow. That's great. Okay, well, we'll definitely look forward to seeing you next week, and hopefully you guys will all be back. And if you have anyone else that might be interested in hearing about that, that's next week too. And
Yes,
yeah,
please do.
yeah, and I'll try to get the link out to people who attended this, just so you'll have it too. And we are recording this, so eventually we will, get it up and post it on our social media. And again, thanks to FCTV for helping us out with this and letting everything run smoothly. And thanks everybody for coming, and have a great rest of your night. And hopefully we'll see you next week or at another
Yes.
presentation. And thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you all so much for coming, and I hope to see you all next week for another presentation.
Okay, have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.